Welcome to the Nova Wealth Show. I am your host, Amy Novakovich.
And I'm Jim Novakovich. We're a husband and wife team and co-founders of Nova Wealth Management.
We also teach you how to build wealth, advise you how to keep it, and how not to get taken advantage of. So let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to the Nova Wealth Show. This is where we help you, give you tips and tricks to grow and protect your money. I'm Amy Novakovich. I'm your host, and follow me on Twitter at Novakovich Amy. Also catch us on Facebook at Nova Wealth Management, and subscribe to our YouTube for quicker, instead of like a big half-hour long show, quick 90-second tips, anything about finance and money at YouTube. That's Nova Wealth Management. And speaking of protecting your money, which is a huge piece of what we do here, because you can grow wealth, but it's much easier to lose everything than to work at it to grow it. It's so easy to lose it. In fact, 70%, according to a study out of a gentleman, professor out of Chicago, and Thomasina can elaborate more on that study in a minute, but 70% of wealthy families will end up losing their wealth because they don't protect their human capital and they don't address the issues within their family. So today I brought on a very special guest, a very near and dear friend to me, simply because I want all of you out there, not only that have wealth, but that are building wealth, to understand that who you are is not just about what you own. This is exactly what Thomasina does. She helps you realize it is more about who you are and your legacy rather than what you own. To tell you a little bit about Thomasina, she is a legacy family consultant. She's a principal at Sankofa Legacy Advisors. She works with clients to be as intentional in developing their family's human capital as they are in growing their financial capital. There's a lot of different types of capital that families have, and we'll talk about more about that in a minute. Clients who work with her develop the capacity to have sensitive conversations and make difficult decisions while navigating the complexities that come with combining family and finances. Ms. Thomasina Williams, thank you so much for being here with me today. I appreciate you taking the time so much.
Thank you, Amy, for having me. It's great to be with you and your listening audience. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it as well, because this is, like you said in your bio, there's a lot of tough conversations. So this is something that somebody who's been thinking about it may not want to address it yet, and may not even know where to go to get the help. So instead, they're listening to our podcast driving in their car thinking, okay, secretly, how do I find out how to do this? So if you could tell a little bit more about what you do, because I know I didn't do it justice. So tell people about what you do and how you help families.
Well, as you said in the opening, I am really passionate about helping families be as intentional in growing their family's human capital as they are in building that financial capital. You know, we as business owners, entrepreneurs, spend so much time building the business, growing the business. We do all kinds of things for
just getting everyday flow and distractions. Like I constantly say, okay, I'm going to do this today. If there's no fires to put out, there's always something. And we get that. To all of you listening, we get there is always something else that you think is more important. We understand that.
Yes. And so building the business is challenging enough as it is in and of itself. When you combine that building of a business with owning the business with family, as you and Jim do, or working together with family in your business, or even if you happen to maybe have borrowed some money from family to help keep your business, get your business started or keep your business going, you've essentially created a shared economy of sorts. And family is difficult enough as it is on its own. When you add the emotionality inherent within family with the challenges and complexities of business, the difficulties are magnified.
Well, there's actually three parts there. There's business, family, and then there's the wealth. Like money changes people. And I've seen that time and time again. So it's not even just the business. It's not even just the family. It's the money that changes people, you know, in their brain. The wiring changes.
Which is why you have to be so careful and be very deliberate in how you deal with that money. Because if you're not, then the challenge becomes, now that you have this wealth, how do we keep it and not allow it to, frankly, lead to a sense of entitlement in our children? How do we keep it and not fight over it, not have misunderstandings? How do we keep it and allow people to still flourish and have some sense of worth independent of their money? And how do you make the decisions about that money? How do you have those sensitive conversations? One of the big
get past those egos, because a lot of times you just mentioned the word entitlement, but a lot of times it's not even the entitlement part, it's the ego. Like, not only am I entitled, but I am the best because of X, Y, and Z. I'm sure you see so many egos. I know I do when I'm working with clients. You have to get past the ego piece of it. How do you get through that?
A big part of that is helping people realize that who they are is not what they own. Simply because I happen to be wealthy doesn't define who I am. And there are different types of wealth. And I think that's where a lot of the ego can come in, particularly in our consumption-based society. A lot of people tend to judge who they are and their self-worth by how much they happen to have in their bank accounts. And so what we try to help people appreciate is that what's the meaning of wealth? We try to help families evolve their understanding of both the meaning, the mindset, and the methods of building and sustaining family wealth.
The meaning, the mindset, and the what?
And the methods.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, what we see, especially, and I know you work with athlete families too, but like even with larger corporations that have built a family business, maybe they started off and it was small. And there's family members that have been there the whole way until it blew up. And now it's a worldwide company, which we've seen as well. But even with athletes, it's their own brand. So they start from teenagers building that brand, and their family is always involved. So the family is there the entire way. So it's hard to separate, okay, are we talking as a family member right now? Or are we talking as a business partner right now? Are we making a business decision? Or are we making a personal decision? How do you help them navigate through those decisions?
Well, that's a big part of what the issue becomes. You mentioned the fact that you have family, you have the business, and you have wealth. Another piece of the puzzle is the ownership piece. And so if you think about family wealth, family businesses, whether it's an operating business like a company, or whether it's essentially a franchise in the sense of a particular athlete or an entertainer or someone along of that nature, you're dealing inside of a family enterprise ecosystem. You think about the family as one system. Families are inherently emotional systems, but then you've also got the business system. Then
also emotional.
It can also be very emotional, different kind of emotional. You can separate yourself from your business partners unless they happen to be your family members.
Unless I'm married to him.
Exactly. Yeah. And another subsystem that's a part of the entire ecosystem is that ownership piece. So there's a concept known as the 3-circle model of family business. And we offer that to families as a framework to understand where people are situated within the entire ecosystem, and then help them figure out, how do I navigate through these different roles? As you said, am I making this decision as a spouse? Am I making this decision as an owner of this company that we're building together? Or am I making this decision as a parent? Am I thinking about my children and my children's long-term wealth? So
I can't even imagine that. I can't even imagine, for all of you, those of you that have kids. I have 4, and I can't even imagine having one of my children work under me. Like, just the way you speak to them would have to be so different, first of all, and then let alone having multiple of them work in the business. And maybe when they get older, they will. But I just, and then to throw money into it, like what you do is so important to not only save the family, because I have clients that don't even have a lot of money, that their family members don't speak to them because of something financially. You mentioned a family member lending. I have one client, she's a mom, she lent her son about $500,000 to buy a house, and he wasn't paying back the loan. So her accountant said, well, she sold another property and was going to have a big taxable event. So he said, if you forgive Matthew's loan, you will get a huge tax write-off to offset your taxable gain. And then all he'll have to do, he won't have to pay you on the loan. He'll just have to pay the taxes on it. And he got so upset that he owed all these taxes on it. She actually forgave a $500,000 loan. So instead of focusing on, oh, mom gave me $500,000, he focuses on, oh my gosh, mom destroyed me and gave me all these taxes to pay, which was like $70,000. Doesn't speak to his mother and tries to rip all 6 kids apart to not speak to her. Like, I mean, you know what I mean? Like, this is just, it's sad. That's very sad to me.
It's very sad, but unfortunately, it's not all that atypical of families to have those kind of disputes around money. And so while we're spending time and resources building our teams and focusing on collaboration at work, we don't oftentimes spend that same degree of intentionality when we're talking about helping our family figure out how to get along. And our work is helping them to have those kind of conversations, to set parameters, to set boundaries. Part of the challenge, it sounds like, with your client is it wasn't clear up front to her son that he had an obligation to repay that. This was a business arrangement. This wasn't just mom giving him $500,000 for nothing.
Correct.
So being clear about the roles and responsibilities is a huge part of the work, and doing that work up front so that there's no misunderstanding down the road and people don't think that you're developing some particular rule just for them, or you're doing this to punish me or to be difficult with me. No, you sit down and start out as a family. If she says she wants to set up a policy whereby she will actually loan all of her children, each of her children, money to buy their first home. What are the requirements though? What's the accountability and what's the expectation from them? She may have a situation where she wants to ensure that they're teaching their children, her grandchildren, how to be responsible stewards of that money. So they have an obligation to pay that money back so that there's a pot that's left there for the grandkids and for whomever else to do whatever else is they want to do. A lot of families actually have family banks, families of wealth, so that you can come to your family and get what you need financially to buy a home, to send your children to private school, maybe it's to start a new business, but you have an obligation to pay that money back so that that resource is there for other people to take advantage of as well. So
talking about like a family trust? Are you referencing like a family trust where they can come and they can say to the trustee, okay, I need these funds because of X, Y, and Z?
No, not necessarily a trust. It can take different forms. A trust is far more complicated. It could simply be a fund that you set aside for people in the family to come to for certain purposes.
Okay.
Lots of families do that. It might even be an education fund. I had a client where very, very wealthy family on both sides. Young woman wanted to do a particular leadership program with a high profile leadership development coach. It was $100,000 a year. Well, she had the money. She could have written a check for $100,000.
Of course.
But because the family prioritizes that human capital development, she was able to go to the family education fund. And the family education fund paid for her to be able to take advantage of that coaching. Again, they prioritize that as a family value. So there are all kinds
of other family members can't really have an issue with that because they knew ahead of time there's an education fund set aside for those specific instances where you want to better yourself and better your education. So the other family members knew ahead of time, if you do something or want to further yourself in education, you can go here. And so there's no animosity, right, among the family members?
Absolutely. Not only is there no animosity, they know they have the same opportunity because it's a set of monies that the family as a unit has come together to say, this is an important value for us as personal development. We are setting aside these funds for family members to come to take advantage of whenever they see fit. So it's a part of that intentionality.
Got it. Sorry to interrupt you. I just thought so when do you normally get involved? Do you get involved then, like when they say, okay, we have all this wealth and now we want to set aside something specifically for education? Do you get involved like in the instance of my client after all hell has already broken loose? Do you get involved when they are just starting to build wealth and build that big business? When do you normally get involved with clients?
All of the above. It depends upon the clients and the client's level of sophistication and what the client is seeking to do. Oftentimes, people who have made substantial wealth, particularly if they built a company, get to a level of riches and wealth that's far beyond anything that they had ever even imagined for themselves, and didn't think about these kind of issues on the front end. So in the case of your client, for example, that is somebody that we could work with, absolutely, kind of an after the fact scenario. If you're talking about a situation where someone is in the process of building wealth, maybe they're working together in a family business now that hasn't gotten to the level of wealth that they aspire to, that's actually a good time before you run into challenges.
I just thought, that sounds like a good time.
Exactly. To set up those kind of protocols and procedures where you're being really clear about roles and responsibilities, expectations, and you're building a consciousness of stewardship from the beginning.
Yeah, that's great. So tell me about a time, because this sounds like you have it so under control, like everything, it's like, what about this situation? Well, Amy, you just do that. Like, you just sound like it's so under control, like I said. So tell me about a time when it goes wrong. Tell me about a time when you give advice, because I can't imagine that people always take your advice, because I know people don't always take my advice. I can put it right out there and say, no, you should not buy this property. Here's what happens if you buy this property, and they buy it anyways. So tell me about what happens, the repercussions if they don't take your advice. Tell me about like a specific example, if you could.
Well, first of all, I would say that I am very careful about, quote, giving advice. I don't think of my work as so much giving advice as partnering with clients to co-create an environment in which they are able to figure out what it is they need to do. Families have that wisdom of what they need, I think, is inherent within all families. Part of my work is helping them to bring that out, to get to the space where they can do that. Because if you think about it, there's always going to be some kind of challenge with your family. Families are constantly changing and evolving. People are being born, people going off to college, there are divorces, new jobs, closing down businesses, there's always going to be something. And so what I try to do is to work with my client to help to build their capacity so that they can have those conversations, they can make those decisions on their own.
You're giving them the knowledge. You're kind of coaching them and giving them that knowledge so they can move forward and have those discussions on their own.
Coaching is a huge part of it, absolutely. Okay. Coaching them on how to do, when to do. I can even work with somebody, for example, in a role play around a conversation they want to have. Figure out what to say, but I wouldn't be the person telling them what to say. I would work with them to figure that out, because I'm trying to build that muscle so that when my engagement is over, they have the ability to do that on their own.
Yeah, build that muscle. Oh, I like that.
And it is a muscle. I mean, oftentimes, frankly, particularly when it's family, we're afraid to say what's in our heart to say. We're afraid to give that feedback sometimes, particularly if it's going to be perceived as critical, because we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings.
Or we wait until it builds up, and then there's a blow up and there's a fight, and you say things that you didn't mean, and it just gets blown completely out of proportion. You know what I mean?
Exactly. The challenge then becomes how you said what you said and not the substance of what you said. So those are all the kinds of things that we work with families to develop the skill set and the capacity, starting really, frankly, with their own self-awareness. We often have a tendency in our society to always look outside of ourselves. It's somebody else's fault. If my mom hadn't written off that $500,000 loan, I wouldn't have to pay this $70,000 in taxes. Looking at mom's role in all of this, as opposed to thinking about, well, what was my role in this? How could I have prevented this situation? How could I have gotten to a better place? And learning from that so that the next time you're not in that same situation. So it starts with self-awareness.
Do you meet with both though? So do you sit down with both the son and the mother separately or together or both?
It's a combination. It depends on what's going on. So oftentimes a lot of work needs to be done with individual conversations,
Not a foundation,
before people are ready to have those kind of one-on-one conversations.
Okay.
Yes.
And do you think, so let's not call it advice, but do you think there are times where you try to set people up to have the right conversation and it's taken the wrong way, you know, from a family member, and then you have to come back into the picture? You know, is this like an ongoing, because like you said, there is always something, there's always something else that will come up. So maybe you give them that muscle, you give them the foundation, they have those conversations, but then it's just taken the wrong way, or they don't get through, or it isn't successful. Then do you have to reroute, or do you revisit it? Do you start over? What happens then?
Well, the work that we do is really a process. So it's not one conversation or even a series of just a couple of conversations. It's a process that starts, first of all, with conversation, exploration, and then clarification. Because oftentimes the things that people think are the problem are just the surface level. Mm-hmm. And we have to work with them to get to what's the issue below. What is this presenting challenge you have?
A lot of times it's a symptom of the actual problem, right?
Absolutely. It's just the tip of the iceberg. And where the real work needs to be done is below the waterline, that part that we can't see, that may have been festering for literally years. So we start out helping people appreciate that this work, first of all, is a process. It's going to take some time. And then we walk them through the process of really getting clear for themselves, as much as for us, about what is the real issue here. Oftentimes the issue that presents itself is not really what's at the heart of the matter.
Right. And so would you, and I've asked you this before, but I'm asking this for my viewers, obviously, but the psychology, remember, I've always said to you, this is like psychology. So you're getting into their heads, or it's a psychological thing. Because a lot of people listening might be like, oh, I'm scared of that. Like, I don't want somebody to get into my head, or it's psychologically, you know, they're getting into my business, or, you know, it's the psychology of it. But you always tell me it is not psychology. If you want to talk about that for a minute to distinguish the difference.
It is absolutely not psychology. What it is understanding how families operate. Mm-hmm. As I said earlier, families are complex emotional systems. And the great thing about having a systems perspective is systems have patterns that can be identified. There are certain ways of evolving systems. Certain things are going to happen. And you know that because it's a system, if you make a change or a tweak in just one part of that system, like a pebble rippling across a pond, it's going to have an impact on other parts of the system as well. So we try to work with families to help them appreciate that the family itself is an emotional system, and that there are ways to identify patterns and predict what is going to happen in certain circumstances. That family system is also part of the larger ecosystem when you're talking about a family that owns assets together or that works in a business together, because that's another whole system. And then you've got the ownership system. So how are all these gears moving together? That is the work that we do to help people see that as systems and understand that everything is happening in relationship to something else.
Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to use as an example the client you referred to earlier. He is taking in isolation that one instance where mom forgave a loan, which then required him to have to pay taxes. That is simply one part of a much more complex system that's going on there, I would venture to guess. And that is not the first time that he and mom have had that kind of difficulty. So that is a pattern that has probably repeated itself since, frankly, childhood. And we help them identify that, recognize that, and then figure out, how do I intervene to create a different kind of pattern so that I can get a different kind of experience?
So let's stick with that example for a second. I'll ask my other question in a minute. But so there's 6 kids, like I mentioned to you. So how do you gear up? How do you give mom the tools so that he doesn't infiltrate the relationship of the other 5 kids? Because that's what he's trying to do now, is destroy the relationship with the other 5 kids. It's so hateful and bitter, but it's reality. So he's trying to get to the other 5 kids so they don't have a relationship. I mean, how do you, how do you give her those tools? I should probably actually just send her over to you. Give us an example, just so we can feel a real life example, you know, how do you give mom the tools then to talk to the other 5 kids? What tone, how does she have that conversation?
So again, it's a process. So what we would do is want to sit down and have a conversation first with mom to understand her perspective on the issue. And
Okay.
again, I would be willing to, I'm not a betting woman, but I'd be willing to wager that this is not something that's happened for the first time in this relationship
Yeah.
or with this young man in a similar kind of setting.
Yeah, he's not that young anymore. He's not that young.
That may very well be, but he obviously hasn't evolved at an emotional level, or they wouldn't be having this challenge. Yeah. So our task would be to try to understand what's beneath that, what's going on there, to get mom's perspective, to get a family history, if you will, to understand what is happening today, what has led to this point, and where has this kind of behavior shown up before. We would also want to talk with that young man one-on-one in a confidential setting, as well as each of the other brothers and sisters. Okay. And if there's a father involved, with the father, we may want to talk to the spouses. So it's, again, this is a system. Everything is happening in relation to something else. None of this is happening in isolation. And it's likely not the first time it's happened. So we want to understand the system that we're entering as a way to be able to help folks guide and navigate through that system and those dynamics.
And so do you usually focus on the whole picture? I mean, do they, like, for instance, I have several families that have multiple businesses, and the families, you know, one's son or daughter runs this business, and it's separate businesses. Mm-hmm. So do you literally sit down and work with every business and all the moving pieces, and you simplify it just down to that? Like, there's a specific process and there's patterns and there's systems that we put in place no matter the type of business? Or does it matter the type of business in your work? You know, does it really have an impact if they're completely different types of businesses or not really?
It doesn't matter what type of business it is. Okay. It doesn't even matter if they have an operating business. It could be that they have, frankly, they sold to some mega international company, and now their business is really managing their money.
Got it. Okay.
It might even be that they, as part of having this significant wealth, have started some sort of a family foundation, and they're running a charitable organization. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an operating business for the same principles to apply. The key is family working together, having to make decisions together about some substantial, significant asset. So what we would say is, in terms of your example about all the different kinds of businesses that are going on in the big picture, it really depends on what the family is trying to do. We would want to understand the big picture, because context is incredibly important. Again, everything is happening in relation to something else. It may not be that the family's ready to deal with the big picture yet. We need to understand it to understand the context. And because this work is a process that happens over a period of time, we may take it in phases and say, well, we want to work on, say, how to help us work together, creating this family foundation. Because then we're not betting, you know, our company, we're not betting our significant wealth on it. We're learning how to work together in a context where if we make some mistakes, we don't get along so well, then it doesn't really matter.
Right. That's interesting. See that, because a lot of athletes, as you know, they all start foundations. Mm-hmm. And especially,
oftentimes it's a way to give mom a job, mom and other members of the family.
That is true. That is true. And it's coming from a good place.
Absolutely.
It comes from a really good place, especially starting the foundation, being charitable, and then also giving mom a job. I mean, it comes from a very good place. But then somewhere along the way, sometimes it shifts back into business, back into the focus is about gaining my exposure in the world, and back about ego. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but then people within the foundation look at it as a bad thing. And then there's a disconnect, you know, like the employees within the foundation is what I'm getting at. So when you're talking within the family, do you also talk with other employees that are involved, that are emotionally vested into this foundation? Because somewhere along the line, sometimes it shifts, the goals shift, and the employees become disgruntled. I mean, do you get involved in that too?
Absolutely, because the employees are an important part of the larger ecosystem. They help to keep the train running on time as it relates to the business. You want to make sure that you're paying attention to what's happening with your key employees, because that also is, again, what you need to run that business. You don't want them to be disgruntled because you don't want to be starting over again and be without those critical employees. So it's absolutely important. I had a case recently where we interviewed, again, start with the individual conversations, exploration, and then clarification. We talked to 19 different family members, as well as 9 key employees who had leadership roles, management roles within the company. So again, trying to understand the complexity that we're dealing with, not necessarily have to, on an ongoing basis, be engaged with all of those pieces. It depends upon what, again, the family's trying to do, but we do need to understand the ecosystem inside of which we're dealing.
And explain how you present this to families, you know, explain how it actually gets, like, what do they take away with them other than just sitting in a great meeting and having a great conversation? Explain the value that you offer to clients. And then I want to get into your personal story too, but explain again how you deliver this information.
So the biggest challenge, again, for families of wealth is oftentimes they jointly own their resources, either because they literally have ownership interests, because family members are on the payroll of a business, maybe that somebody started, somebody's loaned someone money. In some way, they've created some sort of a shared economy. And it's very difficult for people to have the kinds of conversations they need to have when they're working with family. They oftentimes know what needs to happen. They just don't know how to do it. And so what we do is come in and partner with them to help them create a climate in which people feel free to speak up and say what needs to be said. They can hold each other accountable for doing what needs to be done and make the kinds of decisions that need to be made. Our focus is on building that muscle, again, the human capital within the family, so that they can do for themselves, as opposed to us coming in and doing everything for them. And most people just don't know how to do that. And they're afraid of that because it's the relationship. So we coach, we guide, we provide sometimes holding space for family members to have the conversations they need to have, to figure out how to make the decisions, such as, in this case, you talked about, maybe one day one or more of your kids might want to work in the business. If you have children working the business, how do you then decide, you and your husband decide who you want to be the heir apparent to run the business? Is it going to be child 1 or child number 2? What about if you have some children who are working in the business and some children who are not working in the business? How do you treat those children as it relates to the business that's generating the wealth? So families have concerns about what is fair. Do you treat your children equally or do you treat them equitably? That's 2 different things depending upon who the children are. Other kinds of questions, concerns people have is, how do I even tell my children the level of wealth that we have? Children who grow up in affluence obviously know that their family has money. What we find, when I say children, I'm speaking of adults, kind of like your client's son, the 40s, 50s.
No, I have several client situations like that where the children are they're adults, 40s, 50s, 60s, and they have no idea. And they're just waiting till one day to find out.
And you don't, if they just find out one day, then the question becomes, how are they ever going to be equipped to handle that level of wealth if you haven't been working with them over a period of years to develop the skill set, the sophistication, including the personal self-confidence to know what to do with that kind of wealth. I don't even know enough to know the kind of questions to ask advisors, is what we hear sometimes from family members, from particular 2nd, 3rd generation, because their parents were afraid to let them know the level of wealth because they didn't want it to spoil them.
Right.
Yet they, at the same time, haven't really prepared them. So it's those kind of
failure almost.
Those are the kind of paradoxes and conflicts that we help families to work through. Because you don't want a 60-year-old to all of a sudden inherit $100 million And while they knew they had a few million coming, they had no idea it was going to be that level and how to handle that kind of wealth.
Right. Well, tell me about your I should have asked you this right in the beginning because it's such an amazing story. But tell all the listeners about your personal situation. This is a lot of why you got into this business in the first place.
Absolutely. So I am an attorney by training. I practiced law in Miami for 20 years and decided I wanted to do something very different. So I had an opportunity to work in the philanthropic sector for the second largest foundation in the country. Over time, closed down my law practice in Miami and moved to New York to work in philanthropy. That was on a contractual basis. So at the end of my second contract, I decided I wanted to do something different yet again. And I stumbled on a study which talked about how high net worth and ultra high net worth families use philanthropy as a very intentional strategy to strengthen their families, right, as much as for whatever the philanthropic cause is. And through that, I was just really, that resonated with me on a really deep level. And I started investigating that and came across a concept, a proverb referred to as shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. And what that essentially means is the first generation rolls up their shirt sleeves, digs in, works like crazy, and amasses a significant wealth. The second generation lives a very different lifestyle than the first generation because of that wealth. And because, again, of things like families being afraid to let their children know the level of wealth they have and how to even prepare them for that level of wealth. So when it comes to the third generation, they haven't necessarily had the same values instilled in them, the same entrepreneurial spirit of how do you grow wealth once you get it. They haven't been prepared to know what to do with it, and they may not have developed the skill set to communicate around the level of wealth.
Removed. I mean, really.
Exactly. And so
blind, really.
That becomes part of the challenge. And so you get by the end of the third generation, having to go back to shirt sleeves because that wealth is now gone. And the fourth generation is essentially trying to start over again. And so our work is about trying to avoid that. And that was a huge aha for me because my own family, frankly, is a product of the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves proverb. My grandparents are very substantial landowners in Central Florida when I was growing up, but didn't really know what to do to prepare the next generation to know not only how to hold on to that as a foundation, but then how to build it, and then how to instill in the third generation the values, the work ethic, the skill set to know how to take that to the next level. So to this day, unfortunately, I'm sure my grandparents are turning over in their graves that most of that wealth that they created, our generation is not benefiting from that. And so I became very, very passionate about how do we avoid families falling into that shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves.
Well, because I hear these comments all the time, and you hear them, like, oh, that family has enough money, their grandkids' kids are going to have, unlimited amount of money. And it's like, if they do it right, it's never guaranteed. I always talk about if your money, you can choose to have your money be temporary, or you can choose to try and make it more permanent, but that is a choice. That is not something that just happens automatically. And so that's what you do, is you help them make it more permanent to stay within the family.
Absolutely. And what most people focus on when they're trying to make that money permanent is they think about financial planning and estate planning. They're focusing on the assets, tying it up in some sort of trust, perhaps, which is all great and very much needed. A huge missing piece of the puzzle, though, is preparing the beneficiaries, the recipients of the assets, to know what to do with them when they get them. And people who create these trusts don't realize that the fastest growing segment in litigation in this country today is litigation around trust. People trying to break trust. So simply having the money side together is not in and of itself going to ensure that those resources are going to be around for your grandchildren's grandchildren.
Well, I had a client successfully do that. There was an irrevocable trust set up for him and his sister, and he didn't like the terms of the trust. And so he got his sister to sign off, and he got his sister's kids to sign off because he didn't have any of his own kids. So as long as you get all the interest beneficiaries to sign off, he broke the trust and got all the money. And it is not what his father set forth to. That was not the purpose of the trust, and broke the trust. And if he would have been better prepared and why it was the way it was, I don't think it would have been the same result. It's just, it changes everything. Like you said, we can do everything in our power to plan appropriately for all the assets and the money and the accounts themselves. And a lot of what we do revolves around tax planning too. So it's being the most tax efficient and passing the most to your heirs. But a huge piece of that missing is what you do.
What they do with it once they get it.
To have you on. I think this is huge today.
Well, thank you. I think just to follow up on the example that you gave of the client who broke the trust, I would venture to say that his father probably thought he was doing the right thing, but did not in any way involve him and his daughter, involve the son and the daughter in creating the trust. So we would always encourage family members to have that conversation up front. Again, this is where the conversations and the decisions become so important. If the father had explained,
though, Thomasina, they don't like it.
They don't like it, but if they want to preserve what they have, they're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And again, I think most people, it's what they don't like is the discomfort. They don't know how to have the conversation. So if we can help them to have the conversation, walk alongside them in having the conversation and a series of conversations, we find that most people, frankly, may be reluctant. It's a question of gaining their confidence, their confidence in us and their confidence, frankly, in themselves, but that it can happen if they're willing to put in the work. Most people, they would have the conversation if they knew how to handle it. They knew how to do it. And if the other person has also been prepared. So we're working with the family at large. Generally, one of the big differences between our work and your work as well is your client is the father in that instance, to help that father who has the resources figure out how to preserve it.
Right.
Our work, we would be working with the father, absolutely, but would encourage the father to bring in the entire family to have that conversation.
Right, to get the process in place.
To get the process in place, because the father is making decisions that are going to impact those adult children.
Sure, right.
So you need to involve them in that process and help them understand what is it that you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it. They then have a better appreciation and can sometimes come up with a process or some vehicle that actually serves both purposes in a way that the father on his own could never have fathomed.
Right.
Because they haven't had these kinds of conversations.
Well, man, I am so happy to know you, because this is not offered, like with a lot of, like we said, just regular traditional financial and estate planning. And you're such a good resource for everyone out there listening. And I just want to give you the opportunity to tell people how they can get a hold of you. Obviously, you all can contact me. You know how to get a hold of me, novawealthmanagement.com, or you can contact us at our Florida office. But Thomasina, I want you to go ahead and share with everybody how they can get a hold of you before we wrap this up.
Thank you. Sure, Amy. I, as you know, recently left a very large private bank, like recently, as in like the last couple of weeks, to start my own practice. I helped them set up a consultancy in-house for their ultra high net worth clients to do this kind of work. So I'm in the process of creating my website. I don't have one up and running yet, but people can find me on LinkedIn. The name is Thomasina. It's spelled Thomas, I-N-A, because I was named after my daddy. Thank you very much. Yes. My father's name is Thomas, and I'm the oldest. So it's Thomasina H. Williams, and contact me through LinkedIn. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with anyone who would like to know more about this work and explore how we might be able to be a resource for them and their family.
Perfect. I thank you so much for sharing everything you shared today. And I know I threw some specific examples at you, but you clearly know exactly what you're doing and know how to help families. So again, if you want to reach out to Thomasina, feel free to get in touch with me and I can get you in touch with her or reach out to her directly. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for everything you presented today. Is there any last ideas that you want to let the viewers know, or did we we covered a lot?
We did cover a lot. So I'll just end where I started, which is encouraging families, encouraging entrepreneurs to be as intentional in developing their family's human capital as they are in growing their financial capital.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Have an awesome day, everybody, and tune in next time for our next podcast or interview. Thank you.